I'm Jonathan. I'm one of the organizers for today's Bob Lucid Fiction program, which features Ling Ma, who probably needs. I am going to give her one anyways because it's a particular kind of embarrassment to hear your accomplishments read out loud to you, and I quite like inflicting that embarrassment on other people. Ling is an author hailing from Fujian, Utah, and Kansas, who is well known for her characteristic stamp of realist and surrealist prose. She's the author of 2 books, Severance, which was a New York Times notable book, an NPR Best Book, and the recipient of the Kirkus Prize for fiction, among other awards, and Bliss Montage, which came out this past September and is already a New Yorker Best Book of the Year. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Vice, Playboy, Buzzfeed, and more, and she's been the recipient of a number of major fellowships, like the Whiting Award and an NEA Creative Writing Fellowship. Currently, she teaches at the University of Chicago. I don't want to give too much more preamble because we're not here for me, we're here for Ling, and so I'm going to keep this brief and just say how exciting it is to have her here with us as our guest. Because Penn is technically where I first encountered her work, and I'm willing to bet that that's true for some of you too. Severance, her first novel, is frequently assigned in our introductory courses on Asian American literature, in our seminars on creative writing, and in my case, a graduate class on the history of the novel, where Ling's work rounded out a long and arduous romp through Victorian prose. It's a strange pairing, but I remember reading that book cover to cover with a kind of desperation that I typically associate with someone very hungry, while I was on a trip back to Canada that was supposed to last for a week but wound up dragging on for 1.5 years. And I had the same sort of furtive gobbling up of Bliss Montage, which was equally exciting to read. And I snuck pages of it in between work that I was contractually obligated to do, but that was much less exciting than Ling's fiction. So it's therefore with great pleasure that I get to introduce her today as our reader in the Lucid Fiction program, which celebrates contemporary fiction and contemporary fiction writers in honor of Robert Bob Lucid, who taught at Penn for 32 years, from 1964 until 1996. We're stoked to be able to celebrate him by coming together through events like this one, which has been generally supported by Susan Small-Savitsky and Ed Kane, as well as our friends in the Asian American Studies program, the Program for Creative Writing, and the Department of English. Thanks go out to Al Philrace and Jessica Lowenthal for making this happen, to the team at the Writers' House who make this event and all other events here possible, and to my friend Avni Sejpal, who's not here today, but had a big part in laying the groundwork for Ling's visit. 2 years ago, she said to me, only half joking, wouldn't it be great if we got Ling Ma? So this idea was hers first, and I sort of just stole it. The way that things are going to shake up tonight is Ling is going to read an excerpt from a story from Bliss Montage for a little while. She and I will speak very briefly, probably for around 20 minutes, about that story and about Bliss Montage more generally, and then we'll turn things over to you, our audience, both here and on Zoom, YouTube, to ask questions, should they please. If you are so inclined, there is a table sort of directly behind here where you can purchase Ling's book, either with cash or PayPal. And even further behind that, there are some refreshments when you feel peckish. Without further ado, I suppose we should welcome Ling Ma.
Thank you. Well, thanks, guys. Can you guys all hear me? Okay, good. Let's see. Well, thank you for the invite to the Writers' House tonight. I've never been to Philly before. My friend Kirsten attended, so it was kind of interesting to walk around campus and think of my friend. Since I thought I would maybe do something a little bit different tonight and read from part of Bliss Montage that I've never publicly read from before. It's an excerpt from Returning, which is the longest piece in the collection. And I guess I've never read it before because I thought, well, it's a little slow, it's a little quiet. But on the other hand, I really enjoyed writing it, so maybe that will transfer. That means that you'll enjoy hearing it. So I guess I'll set up the synopsis for Returning. It's kind of about a lot of things. There's a lot of storylines in here. But I would say one storyline is that it's about this triangle between 3 writers, and one of them is this graphic novelist named Y. And the narrator has started spending afternoons working at Y's house. So it's her routine, and then she takes the bus back afterwards and goes back home, which she shares with Peter. So this is from Returning, and she'll start off by talking about her first book. I'm gonna grab my background here. Returning. And this is also midway through the story. I began what would become 2 weeks, one evening after work, the week I turned 28. In the nights leading up to the procedure, she would have this recurring dream of seeing her face entombed behind a layer of cracked ice, was the first line that came to me, seemingly from out of nowhere. When she checked the dream dictionary in the morning, she learned that cracked ice was a Chinese expression for the pleasures of marriage in old age. This, she decided, was the auspicious sign she'd been waiting for, and so did not hesitate in signing the liability waiver. From then on, I wrote mostly in the nights after work. After arriving home, sorry, this is like my edits that I want to make for paperback, like my line edits, and now I'm like trying to read my own handwriting. From then on, I wrote mostly in the nights after work, after arriving home, an overheated studio so small it couldn't accommodate a cartwheel. For fresh air, I could reach in front of my desk and force open the window, the tipsy laughter of neighbors on the stoop suddenly so close. For water, the sink was to the right of the desk. I had the clearest sense of myself then. Everything was within grasping distance. I drank huge amounts of tap water and smoked cigarettes and kept odd hours, staying up as late as I wanted, going to work as tired as I wanted. I'd begun the novel after breaking off an engagement and moving out of my then-boyfriend's apartment. We'd been together long enough that the event horizon could only have been marriage, so we got engaged. But the thought of breaking up recurred to me so frequently that it became an inevitability. My ex-fiancé, exasperated that I kept prolonging the planning, finally gave me a talk. "You think marriage is supposed to be a solution to all dissatisfactions of life," he said, "and you're disillusioned because you know marrying me is not going to solve your other issues. But that's not what marriage is for." This revelation didn't prevent us from breaking up, though. I moved out. In my new studio apartment, I wrote about a married couple who, during an economic depression, decide to cryogenically freeze themselves to be reanimated in the future, with the understanding that their holdings will significantly appreciate during the time they spend iced. Their house, their IRAs, their 401ks, their stock portfolio. Given the state of the economy, it was actually cheaper to freeze themselves into the future than to make an earnest effort at a living during this particular period, this political moment. If I felt stuck in the story, I would take a walk, bringing along a can of bear mace, the size of a mini fire hydrant, but not very heavy, that my ex-fiance's father had given me. They were the type of family that camouflaged their wealth in outdoor apparel and camping gear. Whatever equipment my intended in-laws had gifted me, I later sold online to pay the bills. My neighborhood at night, menacing and verdant, fields of bobbing chamomile behind chain-link fences, lurking dark sedans slowing to a crawl alongside pedestrians, the cheerful blare of music from a fluorescent paleteria, was its own kind of wilderness. I felt thin-skinned, softer, more alert. In the novel, the married couple signs on with a premier cryogenic agency to be frozen for 92 years, the maximum amount of time they can afford. Yet on the morning of the procedure, the wife's icing chamber suffers a glitch and malfunctions. When the anesthesia wears off, the agency explains to her that she will have to undergo the process again, but given the intense preparations and heavy dose of sedatives, she will have to wait 2 weeks. She goes home. The majority of 2 weeks takes place within the span of those 14 days when she is alone and biding her time. I was 29, 30, 31, just biding my time. At some point, I quit my job and lived off my savings, doing occasional freelance work to keep afloat. I kept my overhead low. I stopped going out and I didn't date. I was always current with rent and bills, but often didn't have enough funds for, say, flights home for Christmas. It's better this way, I thought, to set the precedent that my family shouldn't expect too much from me. I pretended I was free, untethered from their immigrant striving, their expectation that my life should somehow justify their sacrifices. This winter, Y told me that after reading 2 weeks, he knew the wife wouldn't go back to the cryogenic agency by the end. She wouldn't submit to being frozen alongside her husband. What made you think that? I asked. After the wife is told she has 2 weeks to kill, she doesn't make any temporary arrangements. She doesn't check into a hotel or stay at a friend's house. Instead, she goes home. She gets her pans out of storage and gets food from her garden. That was the first sign, to me at least, that she wouldn't join her husband. In the dark, I could only see part of Y's face. We were lying in the upstairs bedroom of his house. In the afternoons that winter, before it got dark, I would go over to Y's house to work. He had rolled a desk into the living room, an industrial metal U-line behemoth where I would spend hours writing, while he worked upstairs in his study. I lost track of time. That's an errant comma. Anyways, I lost track of time. The night could come on all at once if I wasn't careful. I have to get home soon, I told Y. Peter would be returning from teaching his evening class. Want me to drive you back? Y asked this every night. It's really not an inconvenience. I'll just take the bus. The bus ran only during rush hour. If I missed it, I would just walk. This bed doesn't entice you at all. What Y slept in wasn't even a bed, really, more like a wooden platform with a coverlet laid over it. He claimed that sleeping on hard surfaces was good for a person's back. I'm too used to my soft bed. I have to get back to my soft life. Does your soft life allow for tea before the bus comes? Okay. I got up and he got up. We went downstairs, descending the staircase where his father had had a cardiac arrest. Y had inherited this house from his dad, who'd lived alone after his divorce. His mother had kept their old house in the suburbs, living there with her second husband. The wall decorations consisted of handmade macrame pieces she had made, a 70s hobby she'd revived. Sometimes she would come over, drop off a dish or bags of garden vegetables. I would let her in and she would place the items in the kitchen without going upstairs to disturb him. She seemed to tolerate me, asking clipped questions and feigning interest in my answers. If she wondered about me and her son, she never asked. Y put the kettle on. In the kitchen, we sipped our tea quietly, leaning against the counter. When I was done, I handed him my mug, and though he wasn't finished drinking his, he started washing both our cups in the sink immediately. I cleared away my things from the desk, put them in my backpack. Have a good night, I said. You too, he replied, not looking at me, but at the sink. He was intently scrubbing, swishing the sponge around the rim, where I had left a mark of tinted lip gloss, erasing any trace of my presence. He was still a little afraid of me. When I think about Y now, I think he is neither the problem nor the solution. I walked toward the front door, then looked back. The awkward posture he assumed as he stooped over the low sink, the brittle movements of his arms. All winter long, I had glimpsed his deeply set habits, his regimented schedule. When I left, he would eat a dinner of leftovers, then continue to work until sleep. Everything revolved to a fault around work, around his next book project. If I lived alone, I would have turned out the same way. It is the thing I have been most afraid of happening, my strictness toward myself calcifying into a lifestyle, my traits ingrown so deeply that my oddness surfaces apparent to all. What I was afraid of in myself, I liked in Y. I walked outside, leaving him drying the dishes in that rectangle of light in his kitchen doorway. In his bedroom, we wouldn't really do anything. After working, we would just lie next to each other, talk by the light of his computer screensaver, which projected a slideshow of extinct animals. The Pyrenean ibex, the Tasmanian tiger, the passenger pigeon, the Mexican grizzly bear, the Baji white dolphin, found only in the Yangtze River. This is the most depressing screensaver, I told him. The computer could have been from the 90s. They all look like they know they're the last of their kind. I'd want to know if I was the last one, then I could stop, the search for a mate and just resign myself. He laughed. He wasn't very good at sex, the few times we tried. Or maybe I wasn't, having become locked into the conventions of form with the same person for so long. Not to say that Y was bad at it exactly, just peculiar. He was careful and circumspect, as if I were a weak, delicate handkerchief. He was linear and objective-driven. By analogy, when he finished using a washcloth, he would wring the wet towel in one decisive, calibrated motion so that every drop of water seeped out. In sex, in towel wringing, in dishwashing, as in everything else, he was exactly himself. If being exactly yourself meant you had to suffer the loneliness of being unlike anyone else, he seemed not to mind. The insularity of his lifestyle, the regularities of his routines cradled him. It would get pretty cold outside by the evening. People were coming home from the train, lugging their messenger bags and takeout containers, peacefully defeated. What I wouldn't give to escape those late winters in Chicago, especially the deep post-holiday extremes of late January and February, when, no longer buoyed by festivities and merriments, you're confronted with the empty expanse of a new year, discarded resolutions in your wake, resigned to your own inability to change. The bus came. I got on, greeted by everyone's haggard faces lit up by the blue screens of their smartphones. The wet floor squeaked beneath my shoes. I stepped over a bag of groceries that had exploded in the aisle, revealing pale palliatives, eggs and yogurt and eggs, a broken box of chamomile tea, lemons that rolled around under the seats. It was a whole lifestyle encapsulated in a few items. I picked up a few unbroken eggs, gave them to the woman who was gathering everything back up, a bit humiliated, though it was not her fault. During the years I lived alone, even in my self-imposed solitude, there had been a part of myself I was afraid of. I worked too much, as if it were the only thing, diminishing returns. Left to my own devices, there was a streak of masochism in my single-minded, obsessive habits. I didn't exercise that much, but when I did, it was in gruesome marathons of overexertion. I didn't eat enough, and when I did, it was in wild, sobering feasts, remembering that I even had a body. I made myself sick. Unregulated, I would have eventually destroyed myself. Yet, even knowing this didn't motivate me to change my ways. I would have continued this lifestyle forever if I hadn't met Peter. Our life was so orderly. Grocery shopping on Saturday afternoons and chores on Sundays. I had given in to a natural progression of things, and it was a relief, sort of, to find out that I could live the same way everyone else lived, that I was the same as everyone else. One day you'll spend the night, Y said. Thank you.
I'm really happy that you chose to read Returning, because I think I said this to Ling while we were chatting very briefly before the sort of procession started, but Returning is one of my favorite stories because of a trope that it involves sort of in the latter half of its sort of plot. And I guess, one way of kicking things off is just to sort of ask you to maybe contextualize the rest of the story from which this excerpt emerges, in case people have not yet had the chance to read it.
Yeah, it starts off with a woman, the narrator is in this airport. Well, she wakes up on an empty plane, and she realizes all of the passengers have disembarked, including her husband, Peter. And she kind of wanders through the airport. They're in a foreign country, this fictitious country of Garboza, which is a weird name for a country that I made up. But anyways, he has like the passports, all of the documentation, and at some point she sees him through the airport window that he's left without her. So she's kind of stuck in this sort of subliminal space, basically, and there's a lot of backstory, I guess, and you kind of find out like how their marriage unfolds. Also, they're in Garboza for this festival. That's about transformation, and you find out basically what it entails. And she does eventually try to find him there.
I think that's helpful. I mean, because I was trying to think about what it was about this excerpt that drew you to sort of selecting it as the one that you read today? And I think in your answer, you sort of hit at it. You sort of described the scene as her being stuck in the airport. And of course, in that excerpt, you also describe the sort of protagonist feeling stuck in her life, feeling stuck by work. And reading the collection, I think stuckness or some type of non-movement is something that most of the characters sort of express concern with at some point or another. And I guess I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on why that seems to be such a preoccupation for some of these works of fiction.
Well, in returning, I mean, that sense of being stuck, I think my sort of starting point, what I was thinking about was just how women are always waiting for things to happen. And since you study the Victorian novel, this is probably you probably know this better than I do, that they're just waiting for something to happen to them. And I thought this airport, being stuck in an airport could at least somehow embody that. Mm-hmm. And it is a story that sort of reflects on marriage, reflects on what partnership is supposed to be, reflects on sort of the creative life. So I just thought we would start with her waiting. Yeah.
I like what you said about women are always sort of waiting for something to happen, because in some ways that comes back to the title of this book, which maybe you can say a little bit about. I mean, I know you sort of cite it in your acknowledgments as the sort of initial sort of troping of this film historian from the 1990s, but maybe you can speak about what that sort of trope means to you and what it sort of does here.
Yeah, it's Bliss Montage is a term from film studies. It's from this film scholar Janine Basinger's book, A Woman's View. At least that's where I trace it to. And that book is a study of women's films, this sort of outdated genre that I think ended in, I forget when, the 30s? Could be later than that, actually. And they were sort of these public morality tales involving like a woman as like the protagonist, and usually you would see like, okay, if she cheats on somebody, okay, she's gonna get punished and fall off a cliff later or something. But what Janine Basinger noted about this genre of film is that there would always be this like quick edited sequence of like the female protagonist experiencing pleasure, experiencing sort of getting to play out her fantasies, and it would be this quick, 2-minute segment or something, and it was usually posted before like the heroine's downfall. And nowadays in most popular films you see the Bliss Montage as a feature, like in many films, like Home Alone I always give as an example. Is it Dawn of the Dead where they're also at that shopping mall and they like go through the mall and they like get like all wine or all these all of these goods without paying for it? That's like a Bliss montage. And and I really I was thinking about how like when I start writing fiction, usually to me the entry point tends to be pleasure, so I usually always go in my mind, I'm like, okay, this is the sort of the Bliss montage type of sequence here. Let's just write that. And then we'll see how to expand outward from there.
I think that's, I have so many sort of responses to that. The first one would be, one of the things about the Bliss montage, if I understand it right, is that it also has a very particular like temporality. It happens in a particular moment in a woman's life. And Basinger says it's like after she meets the man, but before he lets her down. The sort of stories in your Bliss montage happen kind of like during or after men are letting women down. And I guess this makes me wonder whether you can say a little bit more about how you sort of where chronologically you're positioning these stories, and because so many of them sort of happen in the wake of men being sort of bad people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually never thought about that. I didn't think actually too much about the placement of the Bliss montage in these stories, or I don't even know that every story has a Bliss montage. Oranges, I'm not even sure if it has one. But I guess I just kind of think of that think of that conceit as kind of a placeholder for me to, begin at sort of a entry point of pleasure in some way.
Right. I mean, pleasure is also a very interesting word to describe what happens to so many of the characters in Bliss Montage, because as I think might have come through with Returning, but it comes through so many other stories, minus maybe Yeti, the story about the Yeti, which is all about pleasure. I mean, it's called Yeti Lovemaking. Yeah. And as you can imagine, the story sort of has an arc about lovemaking with a Yeti. But the rest of the stories are kind of non-pleasurable, or they deal with characters who are undergoing some type of flat affect. And I guess I'm wondering maybe where you're seeing pleasure in these stories, because it seems like it seems a bit subversive, and I'm interested in that.
Maybe. I don't know now that you're mentioning this. Is there pleasure in these stories? Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm thinking about it from the perspective of a writer, like what is the pleasure I want to inhabit and sort of try to embody in the stories, more so than the characters feeling pleasure or undergoing any pleasurable experience.
Can you maybe expand on the pleasure of writing Returning, because that was something that you said, sort of starting out in your reading, that this was a pleasurable story to write for you. Maybe just can you speak about how that came about?
Yeah, Well, it came from a dream initially, and all I had from the dream was this sort of airport sequence, and once I spent a lot of time actually trying to set up the whole what happens in the airport, why is she there, what does it look like. I took a few notes from my dream, but it started to become its own thing. But that actually felt like a lot of work, setting up the airport storyline. But I thought there was something about this character's background that I felt was going to emerge. And I guess I just set up I see the airport sort of storyline as kind of scaffolding to this backstory with this triangle. So to me, that was really fun to think about. And also thinking about winter, which shows up a lot in these stories. Like Severance feels very summer-like, and Bliss Montage feels very winter-like. And and I don't know, I guess I just went from there. Yeah, if I told you the earlier iterations of this story, the only thing that stayed the same was like the airport sequence. At one point there was a mango farm. It really didn't really. It kind of. I tried a lot of things out before I realized what this story is about, and generally my sense of things is. I tried to be an anthro major. I wanted to be an archaeologist at some point when I was an undergrad. And so I always think of this process of writing a story as kind of like every day you're kind of in the dirt trying to pick out these shards and then kind of put them together and reassemble this artifact. Thinking about the story as something that already exists, but you're just trying to put it back together is... to me is I guess it's a low pressure way of trying to write a story, because often, especially when I was younger, it felt like a story had such high stakes. I had to get it perfect, I had to get it right. But thinking it's something that already exists, I'm just trying to reassemble it back together. That tends to be more, it feels like a more organic way or natural way to proceed for me. I don't know if that relates to pleasure.
No, I think that does. Does the process differ for you in doing a sort of a novel length plot versus these short stories? Because this is obviously they're different in form in that respect, which is just a difference in scale. But
I feel like the short story form is a lot more daunting than with a novel. With a novel, I feel like you can write it quickly and continually revise. With a short story, it kind of feels like you could work on it for years, and just have a short story, I guess. And I felt, at least with this one, I wrote it during the pandemic. It felt like, I guess I when you're writing a novel, you're also troubleshooting stuff. You're like trying to come up with solutions, but with like writing 8 sets of short stories, I was mostly working on 6 at a time. It just feels like you're troubleshooting like six sets of problems. So it just felt like there was so much more pressure. But I don't know, the short story form feels really elusive to me, and it's something that I was more compelled to do before I wrote Severance. I mostly wrote Severance. Well, Severance had its own trajectory, but I was also aware, my agent told me, you need to write a novel, so as well. So, but I feel like short stories, it's the form that I wrestle the most with, and so it's the most engaging to me. It's the most dynamic to me. And I don't know if I feel the same way with a novel. It's something different, yeah.
So we can expect more short stories for you going forward, or?
Well, this really tired me out, and it's not even very long, so yeah.
When you were composing the short stories, did you have a concept, like a thing that was sort of connecting all of these disparate tales in mind? Because, I mean, some characters sort of reappear, the sort of transition between LA and Oranges being the sort of major moment. But did you have anything in mind that sort of grounded all of them in one concept or one theme? Like, what did you sort of think about sort of bringing them together?
I thought that they would be in some way about relationships. I had been working on a story collection thematized around that before I started Severance, but this ended up being its own. This ended up being kind of an echo of that project. But beyond that, I didn't really try to make connections. I didn't really try to analyze before I proceeded. I just thought, this is an interesting premise. Let me see, what I can do. Usually, like, there would be a premise that would be very outlandish or bizarre, that I would feel kind of cornered because I wouldn't know how to proceed. Okay, this is a fun premise, but I don't know where to go from here. And usually, I don't know, I would keep putting myself in that situation where I would feel kind of cornered and then would have to kind of, write my way out somehow, kind of thrash through the story a little bit and try to find a solution for it. I don't know, I guess presenting myself with like a problem was a way to sort of start, but yeah.
Well, your response reminds me of a line from a short story called Office Hours, which is about a woman who is a professor of film at her alma mater and who at one moment recalls something that her former professor tells her, which is that it's in the moments where you're at the most surreal that you feel closest to reality. And of course, anyone sort of reading your work will observe that these sort of outlandish premises, these very surreal kind of things, are often sort of brought into dialogue with something that is very real. And I guess I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit more about your choice to sort of have such outlandish or weird or wonky scenarios, and maybe what that does for you as a writer, mixing this sort of surreal and the real.
Yeah, I think, I was thinking about catastrophe and how when something catastrophic happens, it kind of wakes you up a little bit, and it actually makes you a little bit more alive, even if it's something that's terrible that's happening, it sort of sharpens you somehow. And so I guess that the surreal premises are a way of maybe wrestling with the catastrophic in some way, but without necessarily referencing like real life events or our political dramas or anything.
Well, I think you've answered some of my questions, and now maybe we can turn to our audience here and on YouTube for some of yours. An MC will sort of walk down the aisle with a portable mic, so please, if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll call on you, and someone will come down with a microphone. Questions of the audience? Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, okay. You can hear me. I wasn't sure you could hear me through the mask. When we were talking about themes throughout the novel or throughout the short story anthology, I was wondering if, you thought a lot about motherhood and mothers. because I think at one moment in the book, it even references, or like what you said, like echoes back to someone saying, "You write a lot about mothers, don't you?" And I started noticing that right before that line, this like concept. So I don't know, like, was that something you thought about a lot when you were writing these?
Yeah, I remember someone, maybe it was a reviewer or something, saying that I had mommy issues. I actually, well, I did write this while I was, at least part of it, while I was pregnant. So I was pretty, like, I couldn't actually sit up at a desk. So I was, had to sort of lie in a chaise lounge with, like, a laptop desk. And that actually contributed to, like, sort of a... You know, a lot of these stories originated with dreams, so that sort of writing from while, you know, reclining had that strange effect. But yeah, I actually wrote many of these stories while pregnant. But I don't know if that really answers your question.
I think it kind of does, I feel. I feel like it just kind of subconsciously just like pulled itself in there, like with the baby on.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question?
Hi. I was just curious. I know a lot of Asian American artists of all forms feel kind of cornered into talking about their identity as part of their work. I was just wondering how you reconcile that fact with the other stories or other issues you want to discuss through your work.
Yeah, I think before writing Severance, I kind of shied away from like identifying like my character or my main characters as like, are they Asian? I just thought, oh, I guess it goes without saying. I guess the reader would think they're white. I wasn't, the thing is I felt like if I, and this feels like it's a long time ago too, but at the time I felt that if I made my main character Asian American, then it would have to be a story about like identity and cultural conflicts or immigration or something. And I think what changed for me with Severance was I started out, I just thought, well, it's a apocalyptic novel, it's a work novel. The character just happens to be Asian American. And then I just kind of moved past that. But I also thought that her background being Chinese American really gave, I guess, more dimension to her job, which is overseeing Bible manufacture in China. So that worked really well, but somewhere in writing Severance, I just realized, okay, so this is a story about X. The character just happens to be Chinese American. And then afterwards, I just started making them all Chinese American. I don't know why, like, is it to, you know, square away a deficit? I'm not exactly sure, but I just thought, why can't they just be Chinese American? Like, I can have, you know, and they don't necessarily have to have like this origin story or this immigrant story attached to them. They can just be a character. I don't know.
Which, I mean, really quickly to interject before we pass the mic to someone else, that kind of gets thematized in one of your later stories in this collection,
Oh, yeah.
Peking Duck, which maybe you want to say a little bit about that sort of MFA scene.
Yeah, in the MFA scene, now I'm trying to remember.
I can summarize it if you.
Yeah.
Well, basically, in this story called Peking Duck, which is this nesting narrative about a woman's relationship to her mother, to sort of turn back to the first question, the narrator presents a story to her MFA cohort during critiques. And the story is about an experience that her mother had as a caregiver or nanny for a very wealthy family in Utah. And in critiques for MFAs, as sort of the story goes, you can't sort of respond to the sort of comments that you're getting. And the comments that this protagonist is getting have to do with stereotyping. Constantly, it's like you stereotyped your characters.
Oh, right. The mother is like a very submissive Asian female.
But then
so
the kicker is one of the characters says, but isn't this just autobiographical? As if every story about an Asian person had to be autobiography or something. So, you know, this is just to say you sort of thematize this in that story.
Yes, and I feel like that story probably does a better job discussing, all the complications of that. I think after Severance came out, I felt like people were making a lot of assumptions about me or even my mother or my relationship with my mother. And I was also a little bit wary of this trope of like, oh, the Chinese tiger mom. And I just thought, oh, well, is there a way to kind of think about that stereotype? Because, you know, maybe that mother does come off that way, but how do we kind of have a discussion around that? So that was my attempt to discuss that. But it was really, I think that story really started because I noticed that the Lydia Davis short story, Happiest Moment, incorporated an anecdote from Mark Saltzman's memoir, Iron and Silk. It was about a memoir about his journey in the 80s to teach English in China. And then I started thinking about appropriation from there. Yeah.
Back to the room.
Yes, we have a question from the YouTube from Amber. They say your novel Severance features a fever pandemic. Has your relationship with or feelings towards this book changed at all since living through the current COVID pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I did. I think, I'm not even sure how to, I think so I started Severance thinking about, like, I wanted to figure out how do I write a book about work and in the midst of catastrophe. There was this incident, Snowmageddon, in 2011 when we were all supposed to go to work, but the snow was like as tall as like a parking meter and you couldn't get on the train. And I just realized we're living in two different realities, like the reality of capitalism, and then there's like the physical reality of like not even being able to get to work. I'm like 13 miles from work. And I wanted, I guess, to write that Severance sort of around that. And my thinking about work has never stopped through the pandemic. But I want to say more. I notice a lot of how it deviates as well. I know that many people find resonances in Severance to the pandemic, but I noticed a lot of deviations as well. And that's something I'm still, I'm not being very specific here, but I'm still thinking about it. I'm still processing. My therapist has heard a lot. That's all.
We actually have another question from YouTube, from Ray. Why write 6 stories at the same time instead of one after the other? While writing, what moves you from one story to another?
Well, Ray, thank you for that question. I wrote 6 stories at the same time, I think because I would get stuck. I would get to a point, I would push a story as far as it would go, and then I would get stuck and not know what to do. So then I would move on to the next story and then push it as far as I could, get stuck again, and then repeat the cycle. But usually by moving from story to story, it kept me moving. It kept me, and I think that was, valuable in terms of just as a creative writer, just not stopping. But also, I just realized in the process of working on 6 stories at once that similar patterns and trains of thought sort of begin to occur through all of these stories, kind of organically, and in ways that I didn't always plan. So I didn't know it was a technique. It ended up being kind of a technique. I don't know if I would do it again. It was a little stressful. That's all. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This is kind of a basic question, but what you were talking about, for example, in the airport and being in that nothingness space, what do you think is the purpose of writing that idea and that issue in a narrative in this story instead of talking about the issue or the idea more concretely? Just kind of what's the purpose of a story, I guess, instead of just the idea purified?
Well, I guess goes back to that concept about waiting and the concept of like women constantly waiting for things. So I wanted to put her in the space where she has to wait. And also I thought it presented maybe a mystery at the beginning. Why does her husband go off without her? I feel like so many novels, for some reason Bridget Jones comes to mind, have to do with like, oh, the female character is constantly parsing out like what the man is thinking. And instead of doing that, I actually just maybe have her turn inward into her memories and herself a bit. Yeah.
Hi, I found it really interesting that you chose to read from like your line edited version rather than the original. And I thought it was really cool to, I guess, see how the text has changed. And so, yeah, I guess my question is sort of around your decision to do that, as well as maybe what was behind some of those changes, and also if maybe your relationship to the original writing has changed in some way?
Well, I think usually if you read your own work aloud, it becomes very apparent what the issues are. And I've actually haven't read Returning Aloud very much. And so I just wanted to make some changes. But I remember with Severance, I never did that. I just thought, well, there's a bunch of mistakes, I'm sure, in here and line edits, and that maybe parts that aren't so great, that could be polished up a little bit more. But I just felt like, well, it's of a time. The window, it's captured this window of time, which is past, and so I'm not going to make any more changes. I guess for some reason, I don't think the window of time for Bliss Montage has passed. That, and I also just kind of did hasty edits in a postpartum haze. So, you know, I don't mind imperfection. I don't mind when the line is not totally correct. I always know I can fix it if I want, and I also feel like it's, you know, it's a living, organic thing. You can kind of, it'll shift and bend over time. But I do think I'm going to input one round of edits and not look at this again.
You've talked a little bit about the themes that you have explored in your past writing. I'm wondering what are some other themes that you hope to explore in your future writing, as well as what are some of your favorite themes to maybe read and explore in general?
Yeah, well, I think your ideas or your themes choose you. What you're interested in, it chooses you, and I don't think you necessarily have a say. But I've been working on some new projects, and I just noticed that what I'm doing is rewriting an abandoned novel. It's, you know, the premise is completely different and all of the characters are completely different, but the questions are the same as in the abandoned novel. And so I guess themes about duplicates. Where do you locate the self? Authenticity of the self, catastrophe, all of those tend to come up, and probably more that I'm not aware of. I try to, you know, sometimes analyzing my own work, it feels like you're scaling like, you know, a mountain or something. You can't look down. So I really don't know. It'll be more apparent to me later. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, in your book Severance, did the book begin, or specifically regarding the role of work, with a specific acute criticism of late capitalism that you had in mind? Or was it more of a general exploration? And I ask that because when I read it, and I read some reviews, like a elements of the book kind of reminded me of Marx's Capital One, Volume 1, or other like some anarchist texts. So I was just wondering, in essence, did you intend it to be read in this expressly political manner, or did you have any thoughts on this reading or approach?
I think when Candace's voice emerged, it was clear there was like a note of anger in the voice. And so I tried to trace back to where the anger was coming from. And then I knew, I mean, probably in like the first 2 chapters in the earliest draft, that, okay, this is like a novel that's gonna tackle work. And work was the first and foremost thing that I was thinking about. Before like Candace's immigrant background, before any of that, I was like, okay, this is about frustrations of work because of that anger note in her voice. Nobody will believe me, but initially the short story version of Severance was like, the apocalypse happens, then Candace goes with this band of survivors, goes back to, her ex has gone back to Ohio, so she goes there. He's taking care of his zombie mom. She steals a pig from his farm. Anyways, I have like, several paragraphs drafted up of that. So I did not know initially that it was about capitalism or any of that. I thought, oh, there's gonna be like, she's gonna steal this pig. And I researched a lot about like, just like organic pig farming. And there was like a really cute website about, anyways, I got kind of caught up. It was a detour, but it was, as I always say, you have to take the detours to get to where you're going, even if they're like ridiculous detours.
Hi. You talked a little bit about your work being this organic living being, and I'm curious, when do you know that you're kind of ready to walk away from a piece, and maybe when it's time to put it away, think about it for a while, and come back to it?
You mean like if I'm in the middle of like a story, when to come back to it? Or?
I think both when you're in the midst of writing, but also when you're nearing the end. What makes you feel that you're ready for it to be shared?
It's a good question. I think I feel satisfied. I don't know if the story is fully satisfied. I get the sense that it is, if I can like embody it, personify the story in some way. I just kind of get a sense like, okay, we're done. That's not very, I wonder, it's not much to go off on. For a long time, the last story in the piece, Tomorrow, I struggled with that ending for a long time, and it was just unfinished. I just didn't know how it was end. I was like, okay, this describes a situation, but is this a story? And that's something I often ask myself, is this a story, or is this just a situation that's being described? Because I think a story moves, and I think the ending for Tomorrow came to me like it came to me somewhere I wouldn't have noticed. It was somebody had told me about this couple at this airport like being like rude, brash Americans, and I think someone had told me this like years and years ago, and suddenly it clicked into place like thematically. That's what it was. But yeah, I don't know. I just have a feeling. I count on my feelings. I'm sorry. I'll think of a better response. But it feels very intuitive, I think, more so than not.
I think we probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if anyone has some burning inquiries for Ling. We could pass that down.
Hi, so I think you said you studied archaeology in undergrad.
Uh-huh.
When did you begin writing full-time? And was that something you always did throughout college?
I didn't really, so I didn't write for years after college. I wrote during college, and then for years after college, I just thought I'm supposed to be doing something else. And so I guess I was thinking about other applications for writing, so I was kind of working in sort of publishing adjacent jobs, media jobs, for a while, and it just wasn't super satisfying. I did a few like nonfiction, like investigative pieces that were pretty fun, but I felt like I just denied it for a long time, and I think around the time like 27 or something, I just started going back to fiction, and it was really fun. I just had a good time doing that, and it felt, I don't know that I've ever done writing full time, maybe in the summers during grad school, but for a long time I wanted to separate my fiction writing from what I did for a living, because I didn't want to have to depend on fiction writing for like my income, because I thought that it would taint it in some way. I guess I still don't write full time. I write part time. Yeah.
Does anyone want to close us off with one last question at the back? Yeah.
Hi. So from the reading today, just like hearing you read, I gleaned so many like beautiful details. Like even though I don't see your stories as like Chinese American stories, there were like small descriptions that struck me and like felt very much at home. And I was wondering, like, when you're writing those things that are so specific to a particular identity or experience, like, how do you write that? Like, do you make it as specific as possible? Are you trying to like write this experience in a way that feels accessible to people who might not have experienced it? And like, what is that conversation like with your editors as well? Like, are they all for like those types of very specific descriptions? Like,
Are there any stories that you have in mind?
So I haven't read your book Bliss Montage yet, but I remember like I opened the first few pages of it and there was like some description about something, or like even earlier in your reading about freezing, and you said like you related it somehow to like a Chinese phrase or like saying.
Yeah, that was from what was it? A book of Chinese symbols or something that I was just kind of perusing through, and then that seemed to fit. But in general, I wonder if your question is about setting in some way, like.
I think it's about like writing, like because when I'm writing, I always like I want to lean into specificity, and I find that so beautiful. But I always have this fear of like, if they're not like, if this person who's reading my work is not Chinese, like what if they find this unrelatable? How are they going to react to such a description? And I wonder if that's something you've ever like grappled with, or like how you make sense of that.
My way of making sense of it is I separate the issues into a writing issue, or is this a publishing issue? So publishing issues have to do with reception, and then I just think, well, this might not get published, and it probably won't. And then I think, all right, I'll just write it and see where it goes. It go from like an exploratory sort of take like an exploratory stance, just to kind of play things out. The thing about, I guess, writing fiction is you're always going to write more than you need. A lot of it gets tossed out. So sometimes, I don't know, to give myself a little bit of courage, I just think, oh, well, I'll probably toss this out. Or, oh, well, it's not going to be published. And actually, I guess it's a way of trying to keep the stakes low for myself. Where I always tell my students, worry about that once it's accepted for publication. Don't worry about that now. So delineating, I guess, between writing issues and publishing issues does kind of help.
Thank you.
I think that's a nice note on which to end. So I'll just invite you guys to clap for a bit for later.
Thank you.
Applause. And once again, there is food, a little bit of food directly behind you, as well as a table of books, should you feel so inclined to purchase a copy of Bliss Montage. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was
Thank you
very
so
nice
much
to see you all.
for attending, you guys.